patient is in effect brain dead. The operation on Pam Reynolds was complicated by one of the leading experts in this field, neurosurgeon Robert Sputzler, and Pam survived to live another 19 years. However, something strange occurred while she was in a state of zero brain activity. When she awoke, she discussed in detail what had taken place in the operating theater, including a description of what music was played, Hotel California by the Eagles. She also described a series of conversations that took place. She explained how she had watched the opening of her skull by the surgeon from a position above him. She described in detail the bone-cutting device and the distinct sound it made. What is strange about this is that in each of her ears were specially designed ear speakers that shut out all external sounds. In turn, the speakers were broadcasting audible clicks, which were used to confirm that her brainstem had ceased activity. This means that even in normal circumstances, she would not have been able to hear anything. Indeed, as she had also been given a general anesthetic, she should have been fully unconscious. It is important here to clarify precisely what the hypothermic cardiac arrest process involves and how it is monitored. It had been developed in the 1950s, and Reynolds was not the first person to have it applied to a basilar artery aneurysm. Her surgeon, Robert Sputzler, had followed an identical procedure with 7 earlier patients. By this methodology, the patient is given a general anesthetic involving several different drugs, the effects of which is on the recipient's consciousness are monitored through what are known as brainstem auditory evoked potentials. Auditory evoked potentials, AEPs, are microscopic electrical voltage signals generated by a sound through the auditory pathway. The evoked potential is generated in the cochlea, goes through the cochlear nerve, through the cochlear nucleus, superior olivary complex, lateral lemniscus, to the inferior colliculus in the midbrain, onto the medial geniculate body, and finally to the auditory cortex. To monitor the signals, a pair of molded earphones is placed in the patient's left and right ear canals and taped in position. The earphones broadcasted 100 decibel clicking sounds at 11.3 clicks per second. 100 decibels is the equivalent of a power tool operated a few feet from your ears, so it is very loud. While Speltzer was opening Pam's head, a female cardiac surgeon located the femoral artery and vein in Pam's right groin. These vessels turned out to be too small to handle the large flow of blood and needed to feed the cardiopulmonary bypass machine. Thus, the left femoral artery and vein were prepared for use. As she heard the bone saw activate about 90 minutes into the process, Pam began a full near-death experience. She saw her body from outside and felt herself pulled down a tunnel of light. She saw her grandmother and other relatives at the end of the tunnel. She was then told by Uncle that she had to return. She felt him push her back into her body, and on entering it, she described it as like diving into a pool of ice-cold water. It hurt. Contrary to many reports regarding this case, there is no evidence that any of Pam's NDE took place when she was flatlined. In other words, there would have been information she claims she received in her OBE state while under anesthetic. He specifically focused on the issue of what Reynolds could actually hear while in such a deep state of unconscious. He stated that since the early 1970s, it had been known that people under general anesthesia respond to sensations such as touch, movements, sound, and pain. The issue is that these perceptions are rarely remembered when the person regains consciousness. The question of Pam's encounter with the tunnel of light and her deceased relatives is also significant. It is improbable that this would have taken place, as many critics have argued, as she was coming out of general anesthetic, simply because people are incapable of any forms of coherent thought at that stage, particularly not the kind of thought that can create complex and, more importantly, fully recall dreams. This leaves us with the possibility that the NDE aspects, rather than the OBE aspects, took place during the standby process. This fact alone makes this case of profound importance to any serious researcher looking into evidence of the survival of consciousness after death. The central issue of contention in this case is whether Pam was clinically dead during the standby procedure, for how long, and whether this coincided with her OBE perceptions. In his much discussed IANDS journal from 2007, skeptic Keith Augustine of Internet Infidels drew up a timeline of Pam's operation. this from a location outside of his body, the surgeon making a strange gesture in which he waved his arms as if trying to fly. When the psychiatrist and author Bruce Grayson investigated this case after discussing it with both the surgeon in question and Sullivan's cardiologist, who was also in the operating theater at the time, he confirmed that this was precisely what took place. After this, Al Sullivan experienced many of the features described by Ben Reynolds, and of course many other people who claim to have had an NDE, including traveling through a dark space, seeing a tunnel, perceiving an unusually bright light, and meeting deceased loved ones. The Pam Reynolds case is justifiably one of the most famous NDE cases. Clearly, there are elements of it that can be questioned, but all the alternative explanations for it do not prove that it did not happen as Pam Reynolds and Michael Zapom described it. Another much-cited hospital-based case was to present itself 6 years later in the Pacific Northwest. Again, this has proven to be controversial. Central to it was, of all things, a shoe. Alright, so this is the end to our second excerpt. This one was interesting. I mean, I personally feel like I agree with the people that say we don't really understand the mind's consciousness during anesthesia, in the sense that we don't really know like what our brain is able to process and not process. So it's very well that our subconscious mind could have been processing all that information during the anesthesia. So even though she felt like she was watching from third person, maybe that's just the explanation her brain gave her for the information that she received, if that makes sense. Like, it's possible she